Good evening. First, I have to apologize a bit for my voice. I was in the shower this morning and thinking, just like a pimple on prom night, I get this cold and sort of laryngitis right at the time I'm supposed to give a talk. I haven't had a cold in probably 2 years, but yeah, that's fine. Anyway, and Chris, thank you too for the promotion. In technical nomenclature, I am a lecturer at John Carroll. I wish I were an associate professor, but I haven't gotten that tenure track job yet, so.
I associate you with professor.
Oh, great, great. Well, if you wish to call me professor, then go right ahead. Before I get started, a few thanks are in order. I had, as always is the case with scholarship, a number of people who assisted me in collecting material and putting this presentation together. So in that spirit, I'd like to thank Deanna Bremer, Kara O'Donnell, Marion Morton, and Chuck Owen, who generously shared with me the materials that they had pertaining to John D. Rockefeller, as well as conversing with me about Rockefeller and his legacy and those sorts of things. And also thanks to Chris and the other members of the Historical Society who helped to put this evening on for us. And finally, of course, thanks to my wife, Cammie, for her PowerPoint prowess. I would not be able to do this unless she were here. But also for her patience and understanding while I immersed myself frantically in the lore of John D. Rockefeller over the past few weeks. Of course, as Chris has alluded to, the Rockefellers are inherently controversial. And I thought it was just a little bit ironic. I do teach a class in 20th century American history at John Carroll, actually. It's American history since the end of the Civil War. And one of the assignments I have my students do is to wrestle with the question of whether or not Rockefeller and individuals of his ilk were the so-called robber barons or whether or not they were captains of industry. And of course, as I started to immerse myself in this, I found there were no shortage of opinions here 100 years down the road as to whether or not Rockefeller should be vilified or praised for the many philanthropic undertakings that he supported, so on and so forth. So I'm not necessarily going to take a stand on that. I'll weasel out of the very assignment I would give my students. But I do have, in the course of research, one anecdote that I'd like to share with you that I came across. Of course, Rockefeller was famous for dispensing dimes and nickels to people as a sign of his philanthropy, but not going overboard because he believed it was bad to give people too much money. And I was looking through one of the early oral history books on Cleveland Heights in our time, and I found that there were very sharp differing opinions as to whether or not Rockefeller was generous with the average person. One longtime Cleveland Heights resident recalled that old man Rockefeller wouldn't give anybody a nickel except for Bob Hope. He'd give him a dime for a shine, but nobody else could get a nickel or a dime out of the old man. Lucille Kane, daughter of Mayor Frank Kane, had a different recollection, and she insisted that John Rockefeller was well known for generously dispersing nickels and dimes to virtually anybody that he came across. So there you have it, evidence even to this day that there's controversy about this man. I should preface my coming remarks by indicating, and you sort of know you're in trouble when you see your opening screen on the opening slide on the screen and you realize you should have titled your talk somewhat differently. Technically, I think this should be Squires in the Height, the John D. Rockefellers in Cleveland Heights, because this talk will be as much about John Jr., whose importance in Cleveland Heights I think is often overlooked, given the controversy surrounding his father. In any event, this is going to be about both John Sr. and John Jr., and I don't pretend that this is the authoritative interpretation of their legacy. Rather, I hope that it'll be a start for further examination and consideration and discussion of the Rockefeller legacy, and that's, in fact, a discussion I would like perhaps to have a little bit at the end of my talk. First, the legacy of the senior Rockefeller. Of course, it would be wrong to call Cleveland Heights the city that Rockefeller built. Indeed, as is the case in the creation of any city of this size, there are too many contributors to give any one individual primary credit. And yet there is no denying that Rockefeller and his son were instrumental in helping to shape the development of Cleveland Heights. The story of the Rockefellers' association with Cleveland Heights begins, of course, in Cleveland itself. And it's one which I'm sure most of you are quite familiar, and I'll just run through this briefly because I think it's important in understanding the connection between Cleveland and Cleveland Heights and the relationship that the Rockefellers have with that. Rockefeller came to the area in 1853 with his family from upstate New York when he was just 14 years old. He went to Central High School and graduated from Central High School, and after stints as a bookkeeper and a commission merchant, Rockefeller entered the burgeoning oil business in 1863. Oil had first been successfully on a large scale extracted from the ground just in 1859. 7 years after Rockefeller entered the business in 1870, he and several other partners established the Standard Oil Company, which rapidly grew to dominate the oil industry. A decade later, by the 1880s, Standard Oil had put Cleveland squarely on the map as the petroleum refining center of the world. Rockefeller, of course, didn't discover oil, nor did he invent the refining process. Rather, he was a pioneer in the use of organizational techniques that brought some sense of semblance to the chaotic early petroleum industry. Rockefeller and his partners methodically, and his critics would say ruthlessly, acquired competitors, first in Cleveland and then in the surrounding region and finally in other states. This allowed Standard Oil to streamline refinement operations and consolidate management, leading not only to greater efficiency, but, as Rockefeller rarely failed to point out, a more stable market, lower prices, and what he felt was most important, a dependable product. Once he had eliminated most of his competitors, Rockefeller established a presence in many of the businesses upon which the oil industry was dependent, including well drilling, pipeline construction, barrel manufacturing, warehouse construction and management, rail transportation, and retail sales. The idea was to ensure control over the petroleum industry from the point at which crude oil was extracted from the ground to the moment when it was used by the consumer. This, of course, is known as vertical integration. The idea was to do this so that no consumer or rival business could interfere with or undermine Standard Oil's ability to conduct its business however it saw fit. Not surprisingly, by the turn by the turn of the century, Standard Oil had established a de facto monopoly over the American oil business and was already setting its sights on the rest of the world. The petroleum industry, of course, was just one of many businesses and industries that had established themselves in Cleveland in the last quarter of the 19th century, making the city a major hub of production and transportation in the United States. However, the rapid industrialization and the corresponding influx of workers, many of whom were from strange European countries, particularly Eastern and Southern European states, meant that downtown Cleveland was rapidly becoming a less attractive place to live. We go ahead and this is, by the way, an image of Rockefeller about the time that Standard Oil was established. And this gives you an idea of what downtown Cleveland and other industrial cities were experiencing. Business and factories were rapidly polluting the environment. The streets and neighborhoods were growing extremely crowded. For those of you who really know your historical pictures, this is actually Mulberry Street in New York City, but I cheated. I'm sure Cleveland looked just like it. Yeah, sure. And all of these people ended up living in many dilapidated slums and hovels that were very much akin to this. These unpleasant transformations prompted those who could afford the cost to seek out less congested and polluted environs. Bounded by the lake to the north and by the industrial valley to the south, the only option was to move east. No, not even then did any self-respecting East Sider consider moving across the river to the west side. I'll beg forgiveness if any of you are here from the west side. At first, Rockefeller and his peers established their residences on one of the main thoroughfares leading out of the downtown, and this would be the Euclid corridor area, establishing the so-called Millionaires' Row. But as Cleveland's industrial enterprises continued to expand, the old problems of crowding and pollution began to encroach on the exclusive residential district, prompting Rockefeller and others to look for fresher pastures still further to the east. And this is Rockefeller's mansion on Euclid Avenue 424. Not a bad piece of real estate, but compared to some of the other ones, it was actually reasonably modest.
Is that downtown then at 424? Or is that between 22nd and 40th?
East 40th is southwest corner around East 40th and Euclid. Thank you. As Cleveland's industry continued to expand eastward, then Rockefeller and others continued to look for fresher pastures further to the east. And before long, real estate investors and developers were beginning to cast their eyes on the hills that lay half a dozen miles from downtown. The gradual suburbanization of Cleveland was hardly unique. In cities around the United States, as well as in Europe, industrialization was not simply an engine for economic growth. It helped to transform the living and working patterns of its residents. Concerns about the impact of industrialization on society gave rise to what is known as the Garden City movement. The Garden City movement had its genesis in the romantic impulse that dominated many facets of Western culture in the 19th century. The idea was to create new communities that were of a modest size, well integrated socioeconomically, and that were designed for healthy living and a limited industrial presence. The communities, like a garden, were to follow a well-planned and open layout and were to bestow upon residents the salubrious benefits of country living and social interdependency, while retaining the economic benefits of modest industrial enterprise. The concept quickly won acceptance in Europe and then spread to the United States. It's unlikely that such a hard-nosed realist as John Rockefeller would find much use in such idealistic schemes. Indeed, they were often called socialistic schemes. But in time, the Garden City movement would exert a profound influence on the development of Cleveland Heights. For the time being, however, as affluent Clevelanders continued their eastward exodus, the eminently practical Rockefeller recognized a business opportunity was developing on the Heights. As residential development pushed out from the city center along Euclid Avenue, Rockefeller decided in 1873 to use some of the small fortune he had already amassed to acquire several tracts of land that stretched south and east of Euclid Avenue. And here you can see these are the earliest Rockefeller holdings in an 1874 Cuyahoga County plat map. And you can see the one is a very long, narrow strip coming down here. The other comes out south and eastward. And they've already got, in 1874, noted on here that a summer resort was to be constructed there. While the lands would eventually become part of the family's Forest Hills estate, Rockefeller initially viewed the acquisition of property as a commercial investment. In 1875, he sold the lands to the Euclid Avenue Forest Hill Association and then proceeded to buy shares in the organization. The idea was to establish a water cure resort and sanitarium to serve the needs of Clevelanders who sought relief from the foul airs and fetid waters of the city. In order to facilitate the transport of prospective patients to the property, Rockefeller and several partners established a short rail line, the Lakeview and Collimer Railroad, which ran north of but parallel to Euclid Avenue, roughly from 71st Street to Chardon Road. And you can see the rail line just to the north of Euclid Avenue there as it heads out toward Chardon Road, which the eastern terminus would be just beyond where Euclid Creek crosses over Euclid Avenue. The water cure building or idea was an uncharacteristically ill-timed venture for Rockefeller, as the country was in 1874 entering into one of its periodic economic downturns, then known as panics or depressions. Now I suppose we would call it simply a recession. The main building intended to house the sanitarium was only partly constructed before the Euclid Avenue Forest Hill Association was dissolved in the wake of the financial hardship. Rockefeller quickly repurchased the land in 1878 and completed construction of the building. That summer, the property was run as a private resort for Rockefeller's friends, but much to his surprise, his guests expected Mrs. Rockefeller to entertain them. Rockefeller, perhaps for the sake of his marriage, made a hasty and surely somewhat red-faced exit from the resort industry. While Laura Rockefeller, Setty as she was affectionately known, demonstrated no interest in running the Forest Hill premises as a hotel, she and her husband delighted in the grounds and the splendid view of Lake Erie their property afforded. Accordingly, they converted the premises into a summer residence, christening it the Homestead. And this is an image of Rockefeller at about the time the Homestead was established. And this is an image of what originally was intended to be the Water Cure Sanitarium and then converted into the private residence. For the next 35 years, roughly from 1880 to 1915 then, the family summered, starting sometime in June and going generally through October, summered at Forest Hill, even after the family moved or changed their primary residence to New York City in the 1880s. The Rockefellers plainly loved their country estate. John D. supervised the transformation of the lands into a meticulously groomed estate, priding himself as something of a landscape architect. Over the years, he added carriage and walking paths, stone bridges that crossed Dugway Brook. Maybe go to the next slide. This is an image of the gatehouse, the entrance to Forest Hill, and then if you flip the next one. This is an aerial image of the Forest Hills estate, and indeed here you can see this is the Dugway Brook that came through. Rockefeller also created, or had created for him, the man-made lake that you can see there very prominently in the center part of the screen. The 9-hole golf course that Rockefeller laid out on the property. Rockefeller took to the game of golf, which was new, at that time new in the United States, very quickly and became an avid, virtually daily golfer. And he also loved to race his horses, and so he had constructed a horse racing oval so that he could run his thoroughbreds. Eventually, he was assisted in the development of the estate by his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Rockefeller Jr.'s childhood experiences at Forest Hill would imbue him with a lifelong love for landscape architecture and land conservation. And in time, Rockefeller Jr.'s affinity for Forest Hill would prove to be a boon for Cleveland Heights. While the senior Rockefeller was refining his estate, he was also acquiring additional properties in the Heights. His purchases included additional tracts of land along the north side of Mayfield Road. Let me point these out. There's a large tract of land here right where Mayfield and Taylor intersect. And then there are other tracts of land up in here closer to Forest Hill. And with the exception of this plot owned by Valentine Christ, basically Rockefeller owned most of the land on the north side of Mayfield, running from Superior out to Taylor. Rockefeller also purchased land to the west of Coventry Road. These lands in here, which would eventually become part of the Euclid Heights and Euclid Golf allotments. And indicative of the increasing importance that Rockefeller placed on his real estate investments, Charles O. Haight joined the Oil Titans investment management team, quickly becoming Rockefeller's ace real estate investment manager. Rockefeller also established a real estate company to help manage his holdings. It was given the inconspicuous name Abbyton Real Estate Company, derived in all likelihood either from the name of his daughter-in-law, Abby Aldrich, of whom he was tremendously fond, or from Abby and John Jr.'s first child, who was also named Abby. Regardless, few could argue that by the turn of the century, John D. Rockefeller truly was the Squire of the Heights. Rockefeller's commanding presence in the area served as a magnet for other investors, developers, and eventually affluent settlers, resulting in the rapid development of Cleveland Heights in the first quarter of the 20th century. For example, when Patrick Calhoun sought additional funding for his Euclid Heights Realty Company, which was to begin development of the Euclid Heights allotment, Calhoun is reported to have won Rockefeller's backing to the tune of $1 million. In order to facilitate the development of Euclid Heights, both Rockefeller and Calhoun donated parcels of land along both sides of Doane Brook. And you can see Doane Brook here, and these would be the lands that Rockefeller donated. Calhoun's were further down towards Wade Oval and sort of the University Circle area. The idea of donating these lands, and they were specifically donated to create parkland, was again to enhance the potential beauty of the Euclid Heights allotment and further developments that would occur on the Heights. Parkland was a critical asset to have to lure out the sorts of settlers that they wanted. At the same time, Rockefeller's Lakeview and Collimer Railroad, combined with Patrick Calhoun's arrangement to have a rail line run up Cedar Glen into the Heights, ensured that potential residents of the new Heights allotments could travel with ease between their suburban residences and their downtown work sites. And when Calhoun sought to enhance the attractiveness of his establishment by establishing the Euclid Golf Club atop Cedar Hill, it was Rockefeller who leased the lands that made possible the expansion of the golf course from 9 to the standard 18 holes, with the famous stipulation that the 9 holes on Rockefeller's property could not be used on Sunday. Like Calhoun, Marcus M. Brown, a successful Chicago developer, was drawn to the development opportunities he saw in the Heights. Brown purchased property between Coventry and Superior Roads south of Mayfield for his planned Mayfield Heights allotment. Let's see here. I think you have to go one more. Yeah. Try one more. No, go back to it. Sorry. You can just see the edge when we get onto the another map. I'll show you more clearly. But it's the area that lies to the east of Coventry and to the south of Mayfield, going up to Superior and bordered by Euclid Heights Boulevard, basically back in that corner there. No doubt Brown was delighted with the location of his proposed development. He was a great admirer and defender of John D. Rockefeller, and he surely derived satisfaction from being able to situate himself and his development just to the west and across Mayfield Road from Rockefeller's Forest Hill. Later, following the demise of the Euclid Golf Club in 1915, real estate developer Barton R. Deming, who had established a solid relationship with the Abington Real Estate Company, purchased the land formerly leased to the Euclid Golf Club. Here he planned to develop the Euclid Golf allotment as a residential development imitative of Calhoun's, but generally on a more modest scale. Deming worked closely with representatives of Rockefeller's Abington Company, who sought to ensure that the subdivision was developed in a thoughtful and orderly manner and that it would attract only the right clientele. Accordingly, deed restrictions were placed on the properties to regulate the size of the lots, the design and the price of homes, and even the landscaping. Now, developers such as Calhoun, Brown, and Deming were clearly influenced in their plans by the Garden City movement. Their developments sought to establish bourgeois utopias that would provide residents shelter in a bucolic, romanticized setting away from the pressing commercialism, the hustle and bustle, and the crowding and filth that was commonly found in many urban settings. Green spaces, gardens, trees, and shrubs abounded. There was an express rejection of the grid street plan in favor of undulating roads that were given names which might inspire thoughts of the English countryside, Berkshire, Derbyshire, Norfolk, Surrey, and so on. However, the American version of the Garden City movement often dropped provisions for limited industry and strictly regulated where commercial districts could be located. And in a sharp break with the ideas of creating socioeconomically integrated communities, America's Garden City communities initially aimed for exclusivity and social homogeneity. The Garden City communities emerging on the Heights were no different. Like Rockefeller, they sought to reassert a measure of order in their lives and to create a place of grace in an increasingly tumultuous world. The patterns of investment and development in the Heights were also fairly typical. The planning and establishment of garden communities throughout the country was invariably driven by a small group of wealthy businessmen who saw commercial real estate opportunities in addition to the green spaces they themselves sought. Here is an image of the Euclid Heights allotment that was first started by Patrick Calhoun. And these images give you a sense of the beauty and the majesty of the very short-lived Euclid Golf Club, which of course perched atop Cedar Hill right about where the Baptist Church is today. Is that correct? Or just...
The clubhouse sat at basically the corner of Norfolk and Derby.
Okay. Norfolk and Derbyshire.
100 yards from the church.
100 yards off. Okay. Why don't you go ahead? This image will show you then where roughly the Mayfield Heights allotment that Marcus M. Brown developed, and of course how Cleveland Heights is developing in proximity to Forest Hill. Obviously, in spite of the aspirations to create sort of grand estates, nothing can compare with the grandeur and size of Forest Hill. Yeah. And this is an image which gives you an idea of where the Euclid Golf allotment was set up. It was just to the east of the Ambler Park allotment up there toward the top. And these were the lands, of course, that Rockefeller, many of which he had owned, and then subsequently were bought by Deming to create the Euclid Golf allotment. This is an image from 1898. If we actually have this map upstairs, and you can look at the map, and you can see, even though Rockefeller's name is not printed on here, virtually all of these properties have penciled in JDR. So he went on a huge buying spree in 1898, acquiring many of these properties that would then become part of the core development of Western Cleveland Heights. Now, there is a substantial change in the fortunes of the Rockefellers, and I realize that's an odd word to use. I use it sort of figuratively because, of course, the Rockefeller fortunes just continue to grow in the 19-teens. But in the first decade and a half or so of the 20th century, the fortunes of the family will begin to change, and this is where John Jr. begins to take up the reins for his father. By 1900, Rockefeller was pretty much out of the oil business and was now spending more and more of his time devoted to dispersing his fortune in philanthropic endeavors. Rockefeller Jr., or Junior as he was often called, graduated from Brown University in 1879, and upon graduation went to work for Standard Oil Company. However, Junior never developed the sort of taste for business or philanthropy that his father had. And let me qualify and say certainly John Jr. was philanthropically oriented, but he had no interest in the business of having to deal with dispersing the fortune. John Jr.'s real love, it turned out, was landscape architecture and scenic preservation, and he attributes this, of course, to the childhood years that he spent at Forest Hill. Gradually, over the first couple decades of the 20th century, John Jr. Assumed more and more responsibilities of managing his father's activities, and in particular, his real estate activities. Then in the teens, there occurred this series of misfortunes to which I was referring that really helped to facilitate the transfer of the reins of power from the senior Rockefeller to the junior Rockefeller. The first of these series of incidences occurred in 1914 in the notorious Ludlow Massacre. The Ludlow Massacre was a classic early 20th century clash between capital and labor out in Colorado at the Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. And as was typical of the fashion, the sort of striking that the workers were engaged in was not particularly looked upon kindly by the owners of the company. And eventually, militia were called in. Machine guns were trained and fired on some of the strikers, and there were a group of women and children who had set up a series of tents near the mine in order to sort of engage in a kind of sit-down strike. Those tents were torched, and the women and the children inside, of course, perished. Well, this simply added one more blot to the Rockefeller legacy, and in particular, John Jr. was given responsibility for spinning this, to use a contemporary word. Many people held John Jr. responsible since he was now seen as sort of the director of the family fortunes and the family business. Rockefeller went and testified before Congress and actually went out to Colorado and investigated the scene himself. This was a cartoon which I thought was quite amusing, of obviously Rockefeller trying to defend the family name and the family estate in the manner of a medieval knight. And if you do the next slide. There's an image of Rockefeller at about the time this would have occurred. Squire and his son. And one more. This is the picture. Rockefeller was accompanied in his investigation out in Colorado by Mackenzie King, who was a Canadian labor expert and then went on to become prime minister. The Ludlow massacre had a profound effect, particularly on John Jr., and he would spend much of the rest of his life trying to burnish the image of his father, of the family name, and particularly his role in the incident. The following year, 1915, Rockefeller Sr.'s beloved wife, Seti, died. And as a result, Rockefeller's associations with Cleveland Heights and Forest Hill began very quickly to come to an end. In 1917, yet another tragedy befell the Rockefellers when Forest Hill burned to the ground for reasons that remain to this day unknown. So these series of traumas, if such a wealthy and powerful family can be beset by traumas, really started to reorient John Jr.'s thinking. And as a result, he became more and more devoted to philanthropic activities and in particular helping to disperse some of the family fortune. Once the Rockefeller estate burned down and it was clear that the Rockefellers were not going to come back to the area or rebuild, the city of Cleveland Heights immediately began what would be very long and protracted negotiations to acquire portions of the former Forest Hill estate. In the meantime, as negotiations went on, this actually gets a little bit ahead. I'll just hold it there, that's fine. As negotiations went on between Rockefeller and Cleveland Heights, the family made a number of donations of land to help increase the size of Mayfield Road, Lee Road, transforming Superior Road from a clay path into a bona fide 100-foot roadway. And of course, Forest Hill Boulevard was cut straight through the heart of the estate, giving further evidence to the fact that the Rockefellers intended fully on, at some point, letting go of their Forest Hill holdings. One of the interests that John Jr. had in particular was the development of an estate or of a residential subdivision, I should say, on a portion of the former estate. And as early as 1921, although the deal actually doesn't go through until 1938, as early as 1921, this proposed development is already appearing on a zoning map for the city of Cleveland Heights. And of course, if you know at all about the Forest Hills district, you'll recognize the basic layout of these streets. Forest Hills Estates, as this area was originally to be called, was to be one of these exclusive residential developments that reflected the influence clearly both of John D. Sr. and John Jr. Of course, there were the appropriate restrictive deeds put on, and one of the controversies that I've come across in the course of doing this research was whether or not there were racially restrictive covenants put on the properties out at Forest Hill. It's been clearly suggested that the developers and early residents of Forest Hill were not entirely welcoming to people who didn't fit the desired clientele in the community. I did some research, and I, in the interest of full confession, I should really go down to the county courthouse and actually get the deeds. But in the course of conversations with folks from the Forest Hills Association, the deeds never contained, as was true also of the deeds over in Euclid Golf Allotment, specific prohibitions against certain racial or ethnic minorities. However, in the course of participating in the oral history program, I transcribed an oral history with former Mayor Oliver Schroeder, who lived over in the Forest Hills area as a boy, and he remembered that there was a de facto gatekeeper, that if you were a prospective buyer, you had to go there and sort of present yourself, and if you won this individual's approval, then it was okay to buy. So this was done in a way that technically kept it within the bounds of propriety and within the law, and yet the desired social homogeneity and exclusivity was adequately maintained. Now, the actual park plan for transforming Forest Hills from an estate to a park was developed in 1938, and this would have been just after the time that Rockefeller Sr. had died. I've never seen him looking so sort of charming and vulnerable at the same time. This is an aerial shot of the Forest Hill Park and the residential community that was started and had to be ended as a result of the Depression. This image and the ones that follow appear in the master plan that the landscape architect A.D. Taylor had developed for John Rockefeller Jr. And this actually, the original plan in its book form, it was specially published by John Rockefeller Jr. in very limited editions. There's a copy that you can go and look at in the Cleveland Heights Public Library. And it shows everything from start to finish of what Taylor had proposed. The idea was to transform the estate, or the former estate, into a public park or public park grounds that would be jointly shared by Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland. And one of the things that I love about this image is that it shows you the Forest Hills development in a very raw and primitive form. You can see up there at the top the so-called Rockefeller homes in the Norman style that were plotted out, and the idea was to have homes like this throughout the entire area. If you drive down the roads in Forest Hill, you can see these trees. They're still there. They're obviously much larger now, but laid out in perfectly straight, neat, orderly rows. And this was very much in keeping with the Rockefeller approach to sort of imposing order out of a chaotic situation and striving for efficiency and neatness and these sorts of things.
Can you point out on that exactly where you're talking about?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Right, I thought, oh, okay, up there,
Yeah.
not the vertical or horizontal.
No.
Thank you.
Yes, and that would be, I believe that would be Brewster Road. Now, this is Thomas's plan for the park. Simply what he did was to lay over the idea for the park over the existing property. And you can see, as Taylor had initially conceived this, Forest Hill Park was to remain largely a natural setting with some modest modifications. There were a couple of pieces of property that were to be sold off and developed. Two on the top, and I'll point them out in just a minute, were to be sold to the city of East Cleveland, providing the ground for Kirk Junior High School, as well as Huron Hospital, and then another piece down towards the bottom, which would create a parallel development right across from the Heights Rockefeller building on the inside of the arc that the Monticello Road extension would create, and I'll point this out. These are the lands that were to be sold off to East Cleveland for development. And then the territory was right down here that would be sold off. And Monticello, pardon me, would be right in here. Monticello was to come out as it does today, extending into the park, and that would then be developed for a mixed-use commercial residential property right across the road from the Heights Rockefeller building. The ideal, or the idea that Taylor envisioned was a very naturalistic landscape, and this, of course, was something that was very near and dear to the heart of John D. Rockefeller Jr. The reality, however, was somewhat different, and this is just one more image of the plan for Forest Hill Park, if you want. This actually probably gives you a better idea of the estate. I'd forgotten, I've got that slide there. Okay. And this gives you an image of the new developments that would be built in East Cleveland. This is the Glen Road and Terrace right down at the base. Euclid Avenue would be up here. So Kirk Junior High and Huron Hospital would then be in those areas up there. The reality, at least as Cleveland Heights was concerned for the development, was that much of the originally planned natural landscape was turned over to playgrounds, to basketball courts, to baseball diamonds, those sorts of things. And it's an issue that has remained to this day somewhat controversial, of course. I was not here when it happened, but the construction of the community center sort of drew the Rockefellers back into the whole controversy, because this property was to be developed on what had originally been part of Forest Hill Estate. And one of the great-grandsons weighed in on this, and he thought it was a complete violation of what his grandfather, John Jr., had envisioned for Rockefeller Park. But of course, the demands of a community 50 years down the road were considerably different. The outcome of that is, and one of the ironies, is that while Cleveland Heights has developed its portion of Forest Hill Park much more than was originally intended, East Cleveland, the city whose fortunes have truly gone downhill since shortly after this plan was conceived, never really had the money for that sort of development, so that East Cleveland's portion of Forest Hill Park remains much as John Rockefeller Jr. had expected. I should also add, there is great irony, I think, particularly in the Cleveland Heights section, in the way in which the park was developed. Keep in mind that Forest Hill was originally John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s private estate, a place where he could retreat from the unwashed masses and enjoy the bucolic countryside. Taylor's plan clearly indicates a changed attitude about public spaces. He was very adamant that the average person have access to and use of these public grounds. And there was even a controversy, if you will, over the golf course, of course, which was a staple of Rockefeller's estate. In this 1938 plan, A.D. Taylor says, well, it would be very nice to keep this golf course because many of the new residents in Forest Hill are already using it. But he rationalized that the course had to go because there were too few people who enjoyed the sport of golf to put that size territory aside when it could be better used for ball fields and the sort that the average person would use. So the use of Forest Hill Park has clearly changed. The idea of what it could be has clearly changed by the time this plan has been presented. Well, in conclusion, and this is where I'd like to draw you in, what is the Rockefeller legacy? And of course, there are many other things we could talk about here, and I hope perhaps you'll bring them up in some questions you have. I don't like to prescribe or proscribe what I think the legacy ought to be, but I'll throw this out as a starting point. I think it's undeniable that the beauty, the diversity, and many of the amenities that we enjoy here in Cleveland Heights, the things that moved us to come here, have prompted us to stay here when so many other people have gone further east in search of greener pastures. That can be attributed, at least in part, to the efforts of the Rockefellers. But also, and this again I think is the ironic part, the way Cleveland Heights has developed, particularly in the post-World War II era, it developed along a path that ran contrary to their best intentions. And I have a feeling were both Rockefellers around today, they'd be very shocked at what had become of their beloved Forest Hill and their plans for Cleveland Heights. So I leave you with that parting thought, and thank you for your attention, and encourage you to weigh in on this issue of Rockefeller's legacy. Thank you.
Questions?
Yes.
When Rockefeller established Forest Hill, it was in both Cleveland Heights and East Cleveland.
When he established the estate,
Yes.
technically it was early enough on. Can you get back to that? One of those maps. The thing that existed was East Cleveland Township, and there wasn't even a clear East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights in 1874. Basically, this was sort of undeveloped. I mean, it was farmland, is what it was, and there were no certified bona fide cities at that point in time.
Well, when he built the home,
Yes.
was the land divided between the municipalities at that time?
My belief is that it would have been entirely in what was known as East Cleveland Township at that point in time. That Cleveland Heights in 1874 didn't exist. It doesn't come into existence until the 1890s as a hamlet and then as a village.
Last question.
Yes.
What was the basis for the eventual division?
The basis for the eventual division was the way in which the city lines were drawn. I don't know exactly how those lines were, those borders were laid out, who was able to negotiate what. But those borders crossed right over. They basically go down Lee Road to Forest Hill Boulevard, and that's where East Cleveland starts. Does that answer your question?
Not fully, but.
Not
that's
fully.
all right.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yes.
John D. Sr. seems to have moved to New York simultaneously with his establishment of the summer house in East Cleveland. Is that correct?
It's about a decade afterwards, yes.
He moved to New York in the 1880s?
Yes, he established that as his permanent residence. I believe it was 1883.
And when did he establish the summer house at Forest Hill?
He bought the property in 1873, and the house was, it became a summer residence in 1880. So you're correct. It was within 4 years.
So basically, then he moved from Euclid Avenue and 40th Street to New York City.
Yes, that would be correct. And continued to, but the family continued to come out to the Forest Hills estate, and they still had the Euclid Avenue property. I don't know at what point they sold that, but Rockefeller would use that as his foot in the city, so to say. Although when they came out, they would stay largely in the estate. Yes.
Why did you leave?
He was the most hated man in America. He had a huge dispute over taxes. It was claimed, I don't know what the year was, but the IRS started looking, or the predecessor to the IRS, the government started looking into his fortunes, and 1 year he claimed his net worth was only $3,000.
What does that have to do with Cleveland?
Well, once Cleveland got wind of this, they were constantly after him, Cuyahoga County in particular, to get him to pay taxes. An example of that, and part of the reason why Rockefeller basically leaves in 1915 and never comes back, The year prior to the death of his wife, she was very sick, and she truly loved Forest Hills, and so they stayed on uncharacteristically through the winter. And this, I was thinking about this today in the cold weather, and thinking about Forest Hill and saying, well, they'd surely pack up and, head to the heated property. I don't know, and maybe somebody does know, if Forest Hills was estated. I mean, heated. They must have had fireplaces, but I can't imagine much beyond that. So to stay out there through the winter. But anyway, he stayed. Rockefeller and his wife stayed here into February of 1915, and she died later that year. And as a result of the prolonged stay, he was then technically liable for paying taxes to the amount of $1 million or something like that to Cuyahoga County, and they went after him for that. And being the person Rockefeller was, of course, he could have paid it, but he was a man of principle, and he felt they were exploiting him at a time of great bereavement, and it simply infuriated him. And the courts eventually agreed that Cuyahoga County was out of line, and they could not make a claim on him.
Another aspect of that, another reason that he left Cleveland to move to New York is that by roughly the 1880s, New York was literally the financial epicenter of the world. And his empire literally and figuratively could be run more effectively from New York than it could from Cleveland.
Sure.
His business was so capital intensive that he had to make multiple trips to New York to raise the capital that he needed to run the business. And that's also one of the reasons why all of the refineries were developed in New Jersey.
Yes.
Yeah, I may have missed this, but did you describe how he got all this property?
He simply purchased it. He used the portions of the
From whom?
from various. I didn't go through and figure out who the actual individuals were that he purchased it from, but they were the various farmers and what have you who previously owned the land. And when you had a Rockefeller or somebody come along, as is the case today, who recognizes the commercial potential, they're going to buy that land up for a song. Or when you think that he started his acquisitions in a time of depression, I mean, he knew when he could get a good deal. And if a farm family was down on its times, Rockefeller had the money to go in and scoop it up at a bargain. I'm sure if you go and look at the various deeds and that sort of thing, you could figure out who precisely he bought it from, though.
Also, Rockefeller reduced the price of kerosene to probably half of what it had been before he got into the enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
So when they say he was a robber baron, people didn't have electricity in those years, and I'm sure that those that used kerosene lights were very thankful for that.
Well, and kerosene at this point in time was, and as I said, this is one of Rockefeller's concern, it was black gold. Everybody was trying to get into it, and not everybody went through the proper process of refinement. People were cutting corners, so it wasn't always safe. And that isn't to say that Rockefeller always produced safe kerosene, but his concern was to improve and standardize, thus the name, the quality of the kerosene that he was producing.
I returned recently from a trip to Cape Cod, and much of the East Coast that were involved in not only fishing, of course, but the whaling industry. And one of the lecturers say that Rockefeller is one of the most hated men there because he single-handedly wiped out the entire whale oil industry.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me, and that makes perfect sense.
Well, oil was so much cheaper than whale oil.
Right.
Gordon also mentioned the idea that he lowered the price of kerosene and theoretically benefited a whole bunch of consumers who were obviously in a very fixed budget. But at the same time, his lowering also basically made him the godfather of the price war, because the lowering of those same prices is ultimately his tactic for driving his competitors out of business. I mean, we've seen that, very recently, it was the 70s and 80s where the gas stations would drop prices, and so one competitor would cry uncle, and the price would increase by 50% again.
Well, one of
Great at that.
the analogies I try to draw for my students to put this in perspective is, look at what Walmart can do. They have such a massive amount of capital. Their spread is so wide that they can easily afford to drop their prices for a few weeks, drive a potential competitor out, and then put the prices back. So that little smiley face that says prices are always lower, it's got a downside, I guess, if you're a competitor. Right.
Where did Junior live at the time of his death? And is it Junior that has the obelisk, marble obelisk that?
No, that's John Senior. But much of the family is buried. I mean, Seti is buried there, and I think the sister and the mother. And, yeah.
He lives. Do you know?
John Jr.?
When Junior died or Senior died? When Junior died, I think he was in New York.
On the Hudson.
And,
So,
yeah, and,
Petticoat.
So that's.
yeah.
Kia collector.
Kaikut, yeah. Yeah. So technically, I'm trying to remember where he was when he died, whether he was at the estate or perhaps in one of the New York. No. Actually, once John Jr. goes off to college, he's essentially got no real roots in Cleveland. He comes out from time to time, and it was a big deal when he came out when they started with the Forest Hill, but he really left and was a New Yorker thereafter. Yes?
What kind of relationship did the father and son have?
It was a difficult relationship, but it was one that changed, I think, markedly after the Ludlow massacre and the death of his wife. I mean, it was one in which John Jr. was brought up raised in a very strict family. I mean, the father and mother thoroughly instilled their Baptist values on the son, made him sign a I'll never drink or smoke pledge, by the time he was 10. And I think it was a very difficult time, particularly, from the perspective of the 21st century, a very difficult environment to grow up in. And yet, John Jr. loved his father deeply, and I think lived with a perpetual feeling he could never live up to his father. And the only indications that he really got that he did was when his father clearly approved of the way he handled the PR in the aftermath of the Ludlow massacre. And from that point on, John Sr. begins to transfer more and more responsibility as well as property to John Jr. Yes?
Were they involved in any other major land acquisitions other than at Cleveland? I mean, that resulted in a new community or community planning? Or is it strictly because they had this long-standing tie to Cleveland Heights that John Jr. was involved in
Rockefeller
redevelopment?
Yeah, certainly there were properties, Rockefeller Center, most notably in New York City. That's a good question that I'm not sure that I know the answer to in terms of developments. I know they had, for instance, in what became Acadia National Park, that was one of their summer places, and that was eventually transformed into, a public park at the bequest of John Jr. Does anyone out there know?
I can tell you a little bit about Cleveland. When Rockefeller first arrived in Cleveland, he was a West Sider. They first came to Strongsville, and it turned out John D. was also probably the most famous resident that lived in Parma, Ohio. The family owned a farm in Strongsville, and subsequently the properties around that farm were developed into the Rockefeller estates in Strongsville. After Laura Spellman died, his cousin, who lived in Strongsville, then became his housekeeper. The farm properties that were in Strongsville later on were subdivided. And most people aren't even aware of that legacy on the west side. Where he went to grade school, at that point that was still known as Parma, later on became Parma Heights, and where the schoolhouse was, something called Greenbrier Commons, where the city hall of Parma Heights is. And he would commute from Parma and Strongsville to Central High. Central High was on Euclid, somewhere about 9th Street. And later on, it then became the clerk downtown.
Okay. Are you aware of any other residential developments, though, that he invested in, you know?
You mean locally?
Well, or outside of the Northeast Ohio region?
Don't know.
Yeah, okay. It's a good question. I wish I knew the answer. Yes?
I can remember that things were very busy in the Forest Hill Estate. We rented a house on Holyoke Avenue, and this was in 1923 to about 26. And we lived in Bay Village in the summer, so we weren't there all summer, but we noticed in the early spring and in the fall that there was much commotion around the place there. And then, as I told you, one of my father's relatives was playing golf on the golf course up on the higher regions of the estate, and John D. happened to see him there and asked him if he would like to be a caddy. And he said yes, he would.
Oh, that's great.
So that was...
Can you answer a question for me? I came across one reference that makes sense, but it startled me because in all the reading I had done, I had never come across this before, that there was a very imposing, I think, wrought iron fence around the entire property with barbed wire on top.
I don't remember anything like that.
I had never heard that before. I think it was in a...
I've never seen pictures of it.
Yeah. Anybody else heard that? All right. Urban myth I'll have to stamp out. I mean, I was so shocked. It sounded like a prison, and I thought, I can't imagine. I mean, perhaps to keep out the curious and the annoying, but...
One of your images was a postcard showing the gatehouse of the homestead.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know where that was located? Was it down on the lower end or up on like the Lee Road?
Facing Euclid Avenue, roughly where Superior is.
Yes.
The thing down at the bottom, is that a fence or is that a river?
I'm assuming that's part of a rail line.
Rail?
Yeah. Streetcar line.
I knew it.
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, it could be part of his, well, no, it wouldn't have been his rail line because that ran to the north of Euclid. There was a rail line on Euclid, though, was
I don't know for sure, but I'm
It was a
positive
long
that
walk
is Euclid.
from Euclid down to the rail line.
Okay.
Because we lived on Holyoke, and I think there were probably 10 houses between Euclid and the railroad.
Okay.
The Historical Society has some photos that were furnished by the Rockefeller Archives that show the gatehouse from the back looking out to Euclid Avenue, and you can see very middle class and lower middle class houses across Euclid on the street.
Right. Yeah.
So quite a view they have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
We all know his husband's behind us, stand a very strong support of his wife. What do you know about his wife?
I don't know that much. I'm sorry to say.
Born, what about her family and so on?
Can you help me?
Her name was Laura Spellman.
Right.
Family was originally, when they came to northern Ohio, they were in Akron. They were the family, very religious. They were abolitionists. They had financial hard times, and there was a business loss and failure. The family moved to Iowa, and they lived in Iowa for about 3 or 4 years, returned back to Cleveland, or rather back to Akron. And because of the involvement with the Baptist Church, that's how John D. wound up meeting Laura Spellman. After a courtship, married, and then they were involved with the First Baptist Church in Cleveland. And that was on Euclid, I think somewhere about 12th or 13th. And he would lecture in the church and did Sunday school. Really contributed a great deal to the congregation. And when people talk about the deed restrictions regarding races and so forth, I sort of doubt that would have occurred because of the strong abolitionist tendencies that they had in the 60s and 70s, 1860s and 1870s.
I had a discussion with somebody about that, and I said that I knowing the abolitionist associations, and Rockefeller himself supported a couple of runaway slaves.
In Atlanta, Georgia,
Yeah.
was funded by the Rockefeller family.
Again, I need to check the deeds to be specific, and it could be that some of this was done perhaps against the wishes per se of Rockefeller, but on the advice that this was a shrewd business operation to try and keep the community socially homogeneous.
Was Euclid Avenue Baptist Church on Euclid before it moved then to the west side of East 18th Street, just north of
That I
Euclid?
don't know. That's
heard
way
that-
out of my league.
I heard that congregation on the west side of 18th Street wanted Rockefeller to contribute toward the building of First Baptist Church out there at Eaton and Paramount.
He did.
And
He did.
he said, if that's your desire, that this will be the last contribution I'll make. But he said I would prefer that it stay down there at 18th Street.
Yes.
I saw a blurb 20 years ago about the last deed restriction. It was only 20 years ago that the last deed restriction was removed from Forest Hill, and the restriction was Jewish.
My understanding, the Supreme Court ruled in 48 or 49 prohibiting or actually saying they couldn't be prohibited, but they said that racially restrictive covenants were judicially unenforceable. And so, in theory, from there on, there should not have, I mean, the restrictions may have been there, but nobody could get them enforced in court. But again, that's something I would like to absolutely confirm or deny. I mean, the Forest Hill Homeowners Association still has restrictions on maintenance of property, so on and so forth, that my understanding is those go back to the original deed restrictions that were put on the property. I looked at a copy as recently as the mid-90s, and of course there was nothing in there about any racial restrictions.
I understood that you couldn't even have a vegetable garden. And I think today you can, as long as it's enclosed by shrubbery.
And you only grow heirloom tomatoes.
I believe there's more evidence of anti-Semitism in the Rockefellers than there is any kind of Russian bigotry.
Yeah.
But there is a fair amount of documentation that there were Semitic, anti-Semitic issues.
Sure. And one, I can well imagine one could be, have come from an abolitionist background and be generally sympathetic toward African Americans and not see necessarily any hypocrisy in being anti-Semitic.
Blacks didn't rule the world.
Right. Yes.
Getting back to the move to New York, I think that John D. Sr. moved to, I think it was West 54th Street. And when Junior was married, he lived in a brownstone next door. Those were torn down and then became the sculptural gardens for the Museum of Modern Art.
Okay, yeah. Certainly John D. Jr.'s wife, Abby Aldrich, was put the Rockefeller name into the fine arts and particularly its association with the Metropolitan Museum. John Sr., unlike a number of his contemporaries, had no interest in collecting fine arts, and John Jr. didn't appreciate it either until he began to associate with Abby Aldrich, but even so maintained very conservative tastes. He hated the modern stuff and requested that she not put it in any of the rooms that he would frequent in their residences.
What year would have Rockefeller donated the Rockefeller Park area from St. Clair down to East 105th?
1896. He and Calhoun did that on the anniversary, and it was sort of a competitive process. Rockefeller went first in the summer of '96 in conjunction with the celebration of Cleveland's centennial, and Calhoun quickly gathered a similar amount of property and piggybacked off Rockefeller. Yes.
The one slide you had, the political cartoon showing JDR rushing off someplace, that in
Yes.
the corner is a Sleepy Hollow.
Yes.
Did that relate to his residence?
Yeah, Sleepy Hollow was near where Kaikut was. It was
Right, Terrytown?
Tarrytown, yeah, and yes.
What's the symbol on the flag?
It's the Cross of Malta, I know that. And it was my understanding, whether there's somebody really knew what they were doing or they got it because it sort of looked like a medieval emblem. I don't know if there's any association between the family and the Cross of Malta. Does anybody shed light on that?
Volunteer firefighter?
Well, he was putting out a fire, that's for sure.
It looked like the Knights of Columbus to me, but I'm not sure.
Yes.
The whole park that he donated to the two, which became divided between the two cities, was 500 and some acres or more.
I thought it was the Forest Hill,
Yeah.
was it 800? Okay, 800.
But the bigger portions in East Cleveland.
Yes. 2/3 to, well, 3/4 probably of the land was in East Cleveland. Okay.
Okay, looks like it.
If anybody else has any other questions, feel free. I'll